What's up, everybody? I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching Sit Down. James Herbert is here with us from CBS Sports.com, an NBA writer. James, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, man.
You got it. So, winding back a year ago, you and me in New York in the studio, we're talking about Anthony Davis maybe going to the Lakers, maybe going to the Knicks. The NBA was a lot different a year ago. The world was a lot different a year ago. It's pretty crazy how much has changed since we last talked.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we were talking about the draft lottery, if I remember correctly. That feels like a million years ago, not one. I'm sure this will be a significantly different type of conversation to that one.
Yeah, Kawhi Leonard was on his way to winning a championship with the Raptors. That seems like a long, long time ago.
Oh, yeah.
So why don't we talk a little NBA right now, because there's 22 teams in the bubble in Florida. Obviously, the Lakers had an unbelievable regular season up to the point where things got halted. LeBron has Anthony Davis, no Avery Bradley, Rajon Rondo, he's hurt. So when you think about the Lakers, given everything going on with COVID, given the guys that have bounced out, are you more confident in the Lakers now or less confident in their championship chances?
I think you have to be a little less confident. Not that they can't do it. I mean, LeBron surrounded by shooters is an incredible formula. LeBron and AD, probably the best pick and roll tandem you could imagine, right? But they have a little bit less depth than they had coming in. I don't know what to expect from Dion Waiters and J.R. Smith. We just haven't seen these guys play. And the last time we saw J.R., he wasn't particularly effective. Now, back playing with LeBron, maybe he can do the job as basically strictly a spot-up shooter. Maybe he still has something to give on the defensive end, but last time we saw him, he was not very good on that end. I think you're looking at a team that has hardly any room for error, but it also has LeBron James on it. So in any playoff series, he's going to be able to pinpoint the other team's weaknesses and attack them relentlessly. And as we've seen, we saw him, I still will never forget, when I was in Boston a few years ago, the Cavs, it was LeBron's last year in Cleveland. Kyrie wasn't there anymore. Kevin Love, I believe, was hurt for part of that series. They were going with Jeff Green, George Hill as the main supporting characters. And I just kept thinking the Celtics were going to pull that series out, and LeBron just played as well as he has in his entire career. And they end up making it to the finals, and they really shouldn't have. Right. And I don't want to go into this scenario, as weird it is, and go in doubting LeBron. It's just the supporting cast I don't think is as strong as it was even weeks ago.
Yeah, I think anybody who underestimates LeBron James is going to have that one come back to bite him. I think the other question for the Lakers, too, is who is their best five? Because we've seen some lineups where they go bigger with Dwight Howard, with JaVale McGee. Danny Green could be in that mix. Kyle Kuzma is going to play a bigger role. So who are the guys, if you're in crunch time right now, you're Frank Vogel, who are the guys you're riding with?
Yeah, I think that's a question he still has to answer. We don't know what his closing lineup is necessarily going to be in, say, a series against the Clippers, or if they make it to the finals. They have preferred to play big pretty much all season long. We have seen AD at the 5, but I'm one of those people that was expecting to see a little bit more of that. Now, I also wasn't expecting Dwight Howard to be this good this year, and JaVale McGee has remained really solid as he's been for the past few seasons. So I get why they've done that. And I think it has certainly helped them on the defensive end. But I do think if they're going to reach their ceiling offensively, they're going to need to go with those small lineups in certain playoff scenarios. And I think that might be where the best version of the Lakers ends up being. And that might end up being part of the formula for the small lineups, the closing lineups that Vogel is looking for. Danny Green, I think, is an easy one to pencil in and say he'll be there in any significant situation. Beyond that, I mean, KCP, I think his role is much more important now that we know they're not going to have Avery Bradley, now that they're not going to have Rajon Rondo. And I think Alex Caruso is the other guy that you look at next to LeBron, who has just made things make sense on the court. He is not ball dominant whatsoever, but he can run a pick and roll. He can make plays. He's a good shooter. He's a pretty solid defender. The Lakers fans are absolutely in love with this guy, and it sort of depends who you talk to. The hardcore Lakers fans maybe overrate him a little bit, and then people who are reacting to those fans probably underrate him because he's actually been really, really good. Yeah. So I think he's going to play a huge role. And then Kuzma is kind of an X factor here. That's a super cliche term, but he's one of those dudes who I think on any given night can erupt for 20 points or whatever. And if he's making his 3-point shots, then the Lakers are a much better team. Defensively, I think he tries, but he's not the most fundamentally sound player. They're going to need him to be productive in these playoffs, whether or not he is going to be trusted by Vogel in like a tight game in the fourth quarter against another contender. I can't tell you. Like, I don't know what it will look like. I just know if I'm Vogel, I want to feel comfortable playing big, playing small, playing slow, playing fast. Like the playoffs demand adaptability. And I think the Lakers have some of that you will want, but they're not as versatile as they were when they had an Avery Bradley to use. Even a Rondo, who like I don't think had the best season, honestly, in Los Angeles. I think defensively he leaves like a lot to be desired, but in the playoffs, we've seen him come up really big before, and he's an extremely high IQ player, and the Lakers just don't have a ton of playmaking when LeBron isn't on the court. So where are they going to get that from now?
Yeah, no playoff Rondo, and Caruso may not be an all-star, but he's a solid dude out there, and the Lakers are definitely going to need him. And you mentioned adaptability, and I think of Anthony Davis because we've seen him play well in the playoffs when he was with the Pelicans. He's going to have the spotlight on him in a way that he's never had before. So what is most important for AD, just given all the challenges with COVID, with the playoffs, what should he be focused on for the Lakers?
I think the question I have with AD is like, can the Lakers get to a point where when he is the main guy, when LeBron is on the bench, can the Lakers still be maybe not a dominant team, but still a really good team? Can he get to the comfort zone that he had in New Orleans where everything was revolving around him? That's a question I don't think I don't want to say he hasn't answered it, but I would say Los Angeles collectively hasn't answered it. And this has been a problem. If you go back and look at Kyrie Irving when he was on the court without LeBron in Cleveland, there has been a difficulty for LeBron-centric teams to figure out an identity when he isn't on the court dominating the ball, dictating how every possession goes. And Anthony Davis is not a perimeter playmaker, really. He's not somebody who is going to be running pick and rolls a lot. He's not going to dominate the ball like a LeBron James, but I think you can still run things through him. He can still be the hub of the offense. It doesn't necessarily have to be we're going to throw him the ball in the post like a classic big man, though of course he is capable down there. But I think it's more of, can the Lakers avoid a massive drop-off when things are running through Anthony Davis, when LeBron James is not on the court? Because if you look at the numbers right now, like this has been a theme since really honestly a few weeks into the season. People started kind of pointing to this. And again, I don't want to say this is all on AD. I think this is more of like, how do the Lakers want to play when he is the number one guy rather than the number two guy? I think he's probably been the best number two guy in the league this season. He's certainly overqualified for that role. He's probably one of the best 5 players in the NBA. But I think when you're that talented, you need to have a way for that offense to remain elite or close to it when LeBron is not on the court and things are running through you.
All right, James, let's talk about the Clippers, because when Kawhi and Paul George and the rest of the team are there, they're easily a top 3 team in the West. And it feels like Kawhi is just quietly lingering in the back, waiting for his moment. Paul George can obviously take over games. How are you feeling about the Clippers going into the restart here in the bubble?
Like every team, I want to see how they play in the bubble. You don't know how all this time off is going to affect them. You don't know if they're going to just pick up where they left off. The Clippers hope they're going to do that. They've been talking about wanting to do that. They were playing incredibly before the hiatus. I think they were a much better team than they were at the start of the year, not just because they didn't have Paul George at the start of the year. I think they'd started to figure a lot of things out about the way that they want to play. I think Kawhi Leonard, last year in the regular season, as awesome as he was, I don't think he was really going at even really 80% in Toronto during the regular season. That's part of why he was such a big story in the playoffs, right? Like he just exploded. And I think particularly if you have paid attention to the defense he's been playing since about, I don't know, like 5-6 weeks into the season, like it is not right there with what he was doing in San Antonio, but it's pretty damn close. Like he is absolutely one of the best defenders in the world. And I think that effort level, that intensity that you saw in the playoffs last year, you're seeing more of that in the regular season this year. Like he was absolutely phenomenal, definitely an MVP candidate, even though we all know Giannis is going to win it. So I think if they can, continue trying to integrate Reggie Jackson, if they can continue trying to figure out the different lineups they can play. I'm interested, just like we talked about small ball with the Lakers, I want to see a little more of, okay, they have Marcus Morris now. Why don't you just do a front court of Morris, Leonard, and George, go really small? Like Morris has played some 5 in his career. Like that's an interesting look for them. I think they're an incredibly versatile team. Now they're probably not going to have Landry Shamet with them, so it's not like they haven't taken any hits here. But I think that they were my preseason pick to win the title. I want to see how they look. I want to see how everybody looks, because I don't consider this just a straight continuation of what we've seen before. Like, it's kind of a new season. The off season is just like the normal off season, just as long as this hiatus was. But if I was forced to pick somebody to win a title now, like that would probably be my pick. Like, the way they were playing leading up to this did inspire a lot of confidence in their play, at least from my perspective. So it's just a matter of, can they get back there? And then, is it sustainable? How does Kawhi Leonard handle playing essentially every other day? I can't answer that question yet.
Yeah, it's hard to remember that Reggie Jackson, Marcus Morris are actually on the Clippers. And the Clippers, like you said, they have a ton of depth. So outside of Kawhi and PG, when you think about Lou Williams and Montrezl Harrell and some of the other guys on this team, like, or even Pat Bev, like, who is most critical in terms of the Clippers having long-term success outside of the top two guys?
I think I look at the center position. Like, that was a sort of big storyline coming into the year. I think Zubac has done a phenomenal job. I think has been much better defensively than anybody really anticipated. And then Montrezl Harrell played at a near all-star level. The fact that he basically raised all of his offensive statistics, despite the fact they added Kawhi Leonard and Paul George in the offseason. Like, I don't think anybody really saw that coming. But to me, it's really a question of, I mean, this is why I brought up Marcus Morris playing center, is like, if you're in a really tight playoff series against another contender, can you get away with having Zubac playing heavy minutes, or is he going to get played off the floor? We saw last year the Warriors targeted Montrezl Harrell in pick and rolls over and over and over again, and he didn't always fare that well in that situation. I don't think Montrezl Harrell is a bad defender. His hustle is obviously there. He goes as hard as he can go. I just don't think he is necessarily an elite one. He's not a great rim protector. I think Zubac has proven to be a better rim protector than before, but they don't have, say, somebody like an Anthony Davis who can guard essentially any position, and also he can protect the rim. Like, that is sort of the holy grail among defensive centers in the NBA. I think the Clippers have been able to have an elite defense because they're so mobile and switchable 1 through 4 that if their 5 isn't quite there, that has been okay. And I think that should be fine for the first few rounds of the playoffs. But once we're talking about a potential matchup with the Lakers or whoever else they face in the conference finals, assuming they get there, or if they're lucky enough to make the finals, a potential matchup against the Bucks, or even if it's a surprise team like the Celtics or the Raptors, I think we'll be asking those questions about the center position for the Clippers.
Those are some really great points right there. Okay, let's go to the East. The Philadelphia 76ers are one of the most talked about teams in the NBA. Some people had them in the finals at the beginning of the season. Didn't exactly look great throughout the regular season. So we're hearing about Ben Simmons playing the 4 right now, more Shake Milton. We'll see what happens with Joel Embiid. How do you personally feel about the Sixers?
I think they have real upside, especially on the defensive end. I think everything that's come out in the last few days about Shake Milton playing point guard, Al Horford coming off the bench, like that, I think was what we should have expected based on how the last few weeks were before the hiatus. We just didn't happen to see Simmons healthy at the same time as Milton was playing so well. Milton still has to prove that he can keep up that play and do it under much more scrutiny than he was under before, especially in a playoff scenario. But I love the fit. Like, he theoretically does exactly what they need. Like, they needed more ball handling. They needed more outside shooting. They needed somebody that can sort of be a connector between Ben Simmons, Joel Embiid. Like, their roster is extremely talented. It is extremely versatile defensively too. But offensively, I think it has been limiting for Ben Simmons in terms of the spacing out there, in terms of the offensive role that he's had to play. I think even guys like Al Horford and Tobias Harris, they haven't always seemed completely comfortable in their roles. Joel Embiid probably been spacing to the perimeter more than he would like to. He has vented about that to the media at times this season. The pieces just haven't been a neat fit. Now, whether or not the pieces can fit well enough for that defense to be able to hold them up, like, that is possible. And I think going into the year, the people who were super optimistic about them, the people who were honestly more optimistic than I was going into the year, they weren't saying that they were going to be this dominant offensive team that was going to be putting up 120 points every night. The idea was that if they could be, slightly above average offensively and be this like absolute monster on defense, just be dominant, then that could be a formula. They could bully teams. They could make their offense extremely ugly. I mean, this is part of what we saw last year in that 7-game series against Toronto. The team that ended up winning the championship for the majority of that series looked like it couldn't get an easy look to save their lives. They needed Kawhi Leonard to be the hero, getting these tough isolation buckets. And they're looking to kind of grind games out and make them ugly once again this year with an even more defensive slanted team. The question has always been, without Jimmy Butler, without JJ Redick, can they make the offense passable? And I think what they're doing is their best chance of doing that. But I don't know if it will get there. I don't know if, especially if you're talking about a series in the second round in the conference finals, like the Bucks, the Raptors, the Celtics, they're such strong defensive teams, right? So to be able to have a flowing offense against that, to be able to consistently get high percentage looks, high quality looks, that will be their great challenge. And that's definitely been like exactly what Brett Brown and the staff have been obsessing over the past few months. And soon we'll find out if they've come up with anything creative to make that happen.
Yeah, it's hard to remember now, but that game 7, it was so ugly against the Raptors. Jimmy Butler was the biggest reason why they were still in that game all the way towards the end. And the thing with Ben Simmons is, like, he can dominate a series versus the Nets in the first round, then he can vanish in the second round against the Raptors. And with Embiid, the question is always with his conditioning. And then, of course, there's Brett Brown, where it's like some people love him, some people think he's not such a great head coach. Maybe Philly just is what it is. Like, are we just at that point where it's like potential kind of has to be left by the wayside? Like, this is just kind of who they are, or do you still have a little glimmer of hope there?
That's sort of where I was. And now it's just things are so different. I don't know what their opponents are going to look like. I don't know if they are going to change things up going into this. I know Ben Simmons, obviously, he was dealing with a serious injury. What we were going to see from him, if he was even available to play in the playoffs, was going to probably be a diminished version, right? Al Horford has been pretty open about the fact he was struggling with knee issues throughout the regular season, or the first portion of the regular season, I should say. If you're looking at an improved version of Horford, an improved version of Simmons, if Embiid is in as great condition as he says he is, and the team says he is, maybe they do have some upside. Maybe just merely getting to play Milton and Simmons together will unlock something different. I think even in the playoffs last year, like it was a little awkward. It was a little uncomfortable when Jimmy Butler became the de facto point guard, but you saw some games where Simmons was really effective, essentially playing the power forward position that he'll be playing now. He was shouldering a huge defensive load guarding Kawhi Leonard. I think defensively, he's even gone up another level this year. If he's not first team all defense this year, I will be pretty surprised. So I think there is theoretical upside there. And I think I believe that a little bit more now than I did in February and March. But we still have to see how this shakes out. No pun intended with Milton.
Speaking of Jimmy Butler, let's talk about the Miami Heat, because they were one of the best teams at home in the regular season. That doesn't really matter anymore now that everybody's in the bubble. Jimmy Butler is obviously a guy who can be a top 20 player. They have Andre Iguodala. They have Jay Crowder, who you forget actually showed up in South Beach at the end of the regular season. So when you think about Miami, they're a really strong three-point shooting team. They're relying on a bunch of young guys who are really great throughout the year, like Duncan Robinson. What do you make of Heat culture and the Heat and all this?
I think Butler has fit into that as well as you could have anticipated. The shooting has not really been there, but he's just been so incredible at getting to the line and running that team. I mean, he has been a de facto point guard with them this season. Then Dragic has come in and run point with the second unit, and he's quietly like had a sixth man of the year contender kind of caliber season for Miami. I really like the versatility of the roster. They're going to get Myers Leonard back healthy, which doesn't seem like a big thing, but I think just the fact that they can play big or small, they can go with a Crowder at the 4, or they can play Adebayo and Leonard together. That was their starting unit the entire season when Leonard was healthy. They have a bunch of different looks that they can go to there. And I think defensively, their upside is obvious. If anything, their defensive numbers so far this season probably undersell how good they can be on that end at their best. Now, I don't know that they have the elite talent at that level of, say, the top 3 teams in the East. Like, I wouldn't predict a Heat win against any of those teams if the series was starting tomorrow, but I think they've been the kind of team all along, which even Jimmy Butler has said this in interviews, that like they know they're not going to be the favorite, right? But if some things go their way, then they can take advantage of that. They could capitalize on that. I think they have enough talent to theoretically upset a higher seed if they get lucky. And I mean, we're going into a situation where I think you have to assume the variance is higher than normal simply because of the unfortunate reality that people could get sick and people could get injured. And every medical staff around the league is worried about soft tissue injuries, is worried about guys pulling a hamstring or spraining an ankle, or they're knocking on wood and hoping nobody suffers a serious knee injury or anything like that. But like the reality of this situation is they're having to ramp up very quickly, and then they're going to be playing every 2 days, essentially, as long as this thing is going on. I think the reduced travel maybe helps in that respect. But I think if you're talking about the Miami Heat and the chances that they have in the playoffs, I think it is very easy to dismiss them in terms of that top tier of contenders. But when you're talking about that second tier, that this sort of fringe group, you have to at least consider putting them in there because they have been a very solid team all season long. I think Jimmy Butler is a proven playoff performer, and there's so much balance around him, more than a lot of people anticipated coming into the year, because you've seen guys like Duncan Robinson just show up and have incredible seasons. Tyler Hero was injured but before the hiatus. He's going to come back healthy, and they just have a lot of kind of interchangeable parts, and Eric Spoelstra can play this a lot of different ways. And in the playoffs in the past, you've seen him come up with a lot of creative solutions to problems. And I think the roster that he has puts him in a good position to do that.
Yeah, I think Miami is going to be a really sneaky team in all of this. I think another sneaky team could potentially be the Dallas Mavericks, and they're towards the bottom of the Western Conference. And Luka Doncic had some amazing stretches, and Kristaps Porzingis not exactly all the way back to form during the regular season, but hadn't played hoops in a while. James, I know you've talked to a lot of people with the Mavs over the years with your reporting. What are you thinking about Dallas going back into this, and what do you like about the Mavs in the West?
I mean, you look at their stat, they're the best offensive team in NBA history. And they're that because Luka Doncic has been phenomenal. Like, I was as high as anybody on Luka coming out of the draft, coming into this season, but I didn't know he was going to come in and play like an MVP, like at an MVP level this early. And they really like just handed him the keys, and his usage rate has skyrocketed, and they've surrounded him with guys who can either roll to the rim and finish or can shoot. And it's been an incredibly successful formula. Porzingis, I think he started the year kind of rusty. The fit was sort of awkward. Like he and Doncic didn't have great chemistry. I think Porzingis was a little uncomfortable not getting the ISO touches that he was used to, and the team not wanting him to shoot mid-range shots. He was coming from a situation like where he played most recently in New York, where it was all sort of revolving around him. Like he was the guy. He was doing a lot of that kind of mellow stuff, like jab stepping against guys and shooting over him. And that's just not how the Mavs want to play. But they've figured out, like, if he can space the floor and if he can cut to the basket and also just kind of take guys off the dribble, like, he's not really a traditional playmaker or anything, but he can attack from the perimeter off the bounce, especially if he's using a pump fake first and whatever. And like, I thought his pick and roll chemistry, his pick and pop chemistry with Doncic got way better throughout the season. So I think he was actually playing a pretty high level before this hiatus. Now, can they automatically recapture that? Can they get their chemistry kind of rolling the way it was? I don't know. I have like a good amount of confidence their offensive chemistry is going to get there by the time the playoffs start. The defensively is kind of another story. Like, they're not a great defensive team. I think that's why we're not talking about them as contenders, despite the fact that nobody can really stop them. So I think they're one of those teams that it's going to be very fun to watch, just like they've been all season long. But I wouldn't really have them in the conversation as far as, like actual contenders or the teams that I expect could make the conference finals. Like, even when we're comparing them to teams like the Nuggets and the Rockets and whatever, like the Rockets are the team, if they're healthy, and which maybe they won't be. We don't know if Westbrook is going to be able to play or not. The Rockets, I think, probably have higher upside than the Mavs do, because there's a world in which they could be elite on both ends. With the Mavericks, like, they're unquestionably awesome at scoring. The other side of the ball, I just don't know with the roster they currently have that they're going to get there this year.
Especially when things slow down in the playoffs too. Defense is so important. But just this idea of seeing Luka Doncic in the playoffs, and especially if he gets that MVP form, like, who knows if they win a series, what that looks like. But even him just going mano-a-mano with, the Clippers, for example, like, that would just be amazing television to watch.
Yeah, I mean, this will be a huge test for him. And I think he is skilled enough to handle all of the increased scrutiny and all of the scouting reports. Like, he's one of the smartest players in the league already. He's in his second year. It's pretty nuts. But like talking to players on the team about him, like they're in awe of some of the stuff that he does on the court, even though they're in practice with him all the time. They're seeing him take all these crazy trick shots at the end of practice. They know how talented he is. But there's something about the way that he sees the game, the improvisational nature of his playmaking, that even other NBA players, they watch that and they're amazed. And I think you can throw whatever you want at him and you can make his life a lot harder. You can make him give up the ball by trapping him, but I think he's going to pretty much make the right reads almost every time. And at that point, then it's about Dallas's supporting cast helping him and making the open shots and making the right play out of those situations. But in terms of like his poise and his ability to handle that pressure, like it'll be a challenge. But even against a team as great as the Clippers are defensively, I imagine that Luka will be able to read those situations well.
Another team with plenty of buzz is the Denver Nuggets. And Nikola Jokic is 40 pounds lighter since getting COVID. Jamal Murray should be an interesting player to watch. And honestly, who knows what happens with COVID, with injuries, like you said previously. Yeah. Should we actually trust Denver as a contender in 2020?
I don't think so. And I would have said that when they were at full strength. Obviously, right now, we don't know what the roster is going to look like. There are several players who are not in Orlando yet. Jokic did just get there. And I think I don't even know if like him losing all that weight is going to be a good thing or not. Like he's been like just dominating people in the post, pushing them around. And I remember him being on record in an ESPN story about him a couple of years ago when like he was talking about the weight that he lost. And he said at first when he dropped the weight a few years ago, he actually got too light. He wasn't as comfortable with it. So he put on a little bit more weight, even though he's clearly, even if you looked at him before the hiatus, he was a very different guy from who he was when he was drafted, when we saw him in Summer League and all of that. So I don't know exactly what he's going to look like, but I think at their best, their offense can be awesome. Their defense, it looked great at the start of this season, but I'm not sure that they weren't getting a little bit lucky when the numbers looked that great. I don't think they really fit the profile of a great modern defensive team in terms of how versatile you should be, how great your perimeter defense kind of has to be, how switchy you have to be. I don't think the rim protection is that great. Like I think they can be a solid to above average defensive team. I don't think they can be an elite one. And offensively, I think they can be really good, but I don't know that they can be great against the elite defensive teams in a playoff situation. So I think they're kind of a classic team that you can count on them. If their roster looks basically like this over the next few years, they're going to be a very formidable regular season team. But until they make serious upgrades or until some of their players make giant leaps, I don't think we should really be talking about them as contenders.
Yeah, they don't really have another guy outside of Jokic and Murray can be a little bit streaky. Like I like Jamal Murray. I think he's certainly made some good strides, but you think back to last year, it's like he had some good games against the Spurs, played decently against the Trailblazers, then disappeared. And like, I'm sure the great hope in Denver is that Michael Porter Jr. will be a guy one day, but like, we have no idea. He hasn't gotten to the bubble yet. We've seen him in very limited action. So if you're the Denver coaching staff, it's like, who do you throw out there? You know, it's a really difficult situation. So who are the other guys that Denver can rely on? I mean, there's Paul Millsap, there's guys that have been in playoff series, but who else can they potentially rely on?
You know, Millsap is an extremely important player for them, and that'll be interesting when we're talking about the offseason and what he might do. But Will Barton is the other guy, like Millsap, a two-way player who has just helped them basically every minute he's been on the floor. This has definitely been the best year of Will Barton's career. Defensively, he often has to guard the opposing team's best wing player, even if they are honestly a mismatch and they're much bigger than him, much stronger than him. But I think he has acquitted himself pretty well offensively. It has also been the best year of his career. He's shot it very well. He's always been a pretty creative playmaker out of the pick and roll. And I think he has just matured and he's worked on like kind of rounding out his game. And this is the best that he's ever been. But I think even when you look at Barton and Gary Harris and Michael Porter Jr. with the sort of flashes that he's shown, I think you still have questions about their ring rotation, right? Like if they're going up against a Lakers team with LeBron James, like the nominal point guard or the nominal small forward, if he's playing with a Caruso or a Quinn Cook or whoever's out there theoretically manning the point, or if they're playing against the Clippers with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George on the court at the same time, like the Nuggets just don't really have a good answer in terms of who to stick on those guys. Like Torrey Craig was the guy that they trusted to do that in the past. This year, his minutes have been pretty erratic. I don't know that Malone fully trusts him. I think he trusts him defensively, of course. He's earned that. But his shot is not reliable. And when we saw him even in the playoffs last year, we know what opposing teams are going to do against Torrey Craig. They're just going to sag back and dare him to shoot. So I don't know how many minutes he's going to get in a playoff scenario, but I do think that is like one area where you can just zero right in and say the Nuggets need to address that in some form eventually. It doesn't have to be necessarily like this coming off season, but certainly in the next couple of years, if they're serious about competing for championships, like as good as Will Barton is, and as great as he's been this year, and as good as Gary Harris was a couple of years ago. And by the way, please, Gary Harris, it would be awesome to see him regain his form when they come back. He actually played decently in the the 5, 6, 7 games before the hiatus. It seemed like maybe he was turning a corner. I don't know if that was real, but even if they're kind of the best versions of themselves, they're still just kind of small. Like they're still not who you're super comfortable saying, all right, you have Paul George, you go defend him one-on-one and we'll give you help if you need it, but not every time.
It's going to be a fascinating playoffs, a playoffs unlike any other. James Herbert, thanks a lot, man. We'll catch all your work on CBSSports.com and talk to you down the road, all right?
Yeah, thanks for having me.